Hello, welcome to our weather lesson today on this Tuesday, March 31st. Today we are talking about fronts, and that is mainly because we have a front moving in right now. I thought, what a perfect day to talk about a weather topic that we're actually seeing happen as we speak. So we have had really warm weather recently in South Louisiana. We had 7 days of record high temperatures in the middle and upper 80s, and finally, we're getting a cool front move through, so I know a lot of folks probably excited about that. Tomorrow is going to be really nice, actually, just for a little forecast update before we get into our weather lesson. We should have temperatures early tomorrow morning in the 50s, and then tomorrow afternoon will only be around 74 for the daytime high, so that will be a much cooler kind of setup than we've seen lately. So thanks for joining me on this weather lesson today, where again we're talking about fronts, and what we're going to talk about today are really just kind of covering very quickly all the different kinds of fronts and also the kinds of surface features, we would call it, that we show on our weather maps. So when you turn on Channel 4, you watch us streaming, or you look at our apps and you see us, our meteorologists, showing the surface map. Hopefully both students who are probably joining me, I hope that you are. If you're a kid, I'm happy to talk about fronts with you today. And if you're an adult, if you just watch the weather and you see these different symbols pop up on our surface maps, this might just give you a little bit more kind of context as to what exactly they mean. So here they are, the different kinds of fronts that we are talking about today. We're talking about, of course, cold fronts that we're seeing move in right now. We're talking about warm fronts, stationary fronts, and something called an occluded front. And then there are three other things that look like fronts on our surface map, and that is dry lines, squall lines, and troughs. So we will just kind of briefly cover all of these today, and we will be getting excited about the cool down that we're going to get on Wednesday. Actually, it'll be the coolest tomorrow morning that we've seen since March 8th. So the coolest in over 3 weeks for us here in New Orleans, if we do get into that kind of upper 50s sort of frame for lows on Wednesday morning. So we will jump into it. Cold fronts. I know we're going to start with one that many people recognize, of course, and it is represented on our weather maps by this blue line with the triangles facing in the direction in which the front is moving. So cold fronts are, of course, colder air displacing a warmer air mass. We have different air masses across the US and across the world. Some of them have more moisture in them, some of them are drier, some are cooler, some are warmer. And so when we have a cooler air mass moving into, or kind of being driven into, a warm air mass area, that would be the cold front. Cold air displaces the warm air, and one thing to think about with this is that it is relative. The cold front that we get in the summer is still called a cold front because it's a cooler air mass moving into a less cool air mass. So that action is still there. But a lot of times in the summer when we say stuff like that, like, oh, we'll get a little cool front in July, making it only 90 degrees tomorrow instead of 95. I know that sounds a little confusing and a little bit kind of overly hopeful perhaps for a lot of us in the summertime, very optimistic, right, to call that a cold front, but it is kind of relative when you talk about the meteorology. If you have a cooler air mass moving into a warmer air mass, even if the difference is not that big, it would still be a cold front. There are, of course, not just cold fronts, but also warm fronts. So when we show this on the map, and again, for student friends, if you're joining me and have been watching maybe the weather forecast lately, this would be what represents a warm front. So this would be the red line, and it has little half moons, and on this side in which the warm air is moving. So warm fronts, just kind of the opposite of cold fronts, of course, would be warm air displacing cold air, a warmer air mass moving into a colder air mass and displacing it. Here, we often have warm fronts coming really fast after cold fronts. So in New Orleans, of course, we're right next to the Gulf of Mexico. Often a typical pattern that we see, and you know, if you've lived here for a long time, if you're a student though joining me, this will be something to think about. We often get a cold front moving in, moving just south of the coastline into the Gulf of Mexico, and then often that same boundary between the two air masses will move back north. So we will see cooler air come in, and then it will get driven back to the north, and that would be a warm front. So that's a kind of quick little turnaround that we get here all the way on the southern part of the US along the Gulf of Mexico. So that's pretty common for us to see. Also, something to think about comparing warm and cool air masses is that when we get a warm air mass moving in ahead of a cold air mass, a lot of times we get that set up as well, that would set us up for showers and thunderstorms, because a warmer, more moist air mass from the Gulf of Mexico moving to the north would put more moisture into the atmosphere, so that when cold fronts arrive, they kind of force all that up. And as we've talked about last week in our weather lessons and this week, that causes rising, it causes lift in the atmosphere. There can be moisture and instability. We would need all those ingredients to get showers and especially thunderstorms. So those are the two big types that you'll see, the blue cold fronts and the red warm fronts. You may also have seen this, a nice little mixture of the two. And so for my student friends, what would you think that this is? This would be, of course, kind of just a stationary front. Some of you may know this. And this would be the spot, or just kind of a boundary between two air masses that really isn't moving very much. So stationary, sometimes it can also be termed quasi-stationary fronts. And that would be where you just have kind of maybe a slightly cooler air mass or a slightly warmer air mass. And, you know, it just kind of sits there. It's not really moving north or south or east or west. Usually when you have stationary fronts, there isn't a really drastic difference in temperatures, but sometimes there is. I've seen days in South Louisiana where we'll have a front just kind of sitting over our area, and those of you around Mandeville and Madisonville and Slidell may be in the 50s, and then it may be 60s to about 70 south of that stationary front for New Orleans. So sometimes we get this really, really obvious, what we would call a temperature gradient, with warmer on one side and cooler on the other. But again, most of the time with a stationary front, the difference may not be all that noticeable. One thing also with the stationary front, and again, you can see it kind of combines the two elements. This would be the warm front icon or image, and this would be the cold front. When you get a stationary front, what we see sometimes, especially in the spring in South Louisiana, is a stationary front setting up over us, staying there, and then sometimes just providing an area for showers and storms to form. So sometimes when we see that kind of repeated shower and storm formation along the same stationary front, that can sometimes lead to our heavy rain and flooding events. So sometimes, you know, with certain ingredients in the atmosphere, stationary fronts sometimes aren't that great a thing for us, because they can really allow a lot of rain to happen in the same location. Not all the time by any means, but sometimes we do watch for that. Okay, here is a new one that I think will probably be new, maybe even for some of my adult friends. Here is the occluded front. And so this one is purple. Actually on our graphic system, it comes up like a really bright magenta shade. And notice that it has both the warm and the cold icons, but again, it would be a kind of purplish color normally. And these are set colors that go on meteorology surface maps. For sure, you know, just the same all over the place. So an occluded front is a little bit different. We don't really see it that often, over us occasionally, but this would involve three air masses, the occluded front. It's not just warm and cold. There's usually a cool air mass, there's a warm air mass, and then there's another colder air mass coming in. Now, interestingly, cold fronts usually move faster than warm fronts. So in an occluded front, you have colder air catching up to the warm front and cool front, or the warm and cool air masses. And so it would involve these three elements. We see these, I notice them a lot far to the north of us, especially across like the plains states in the winter and in the spring. Often you can see those occluded fronts forming. But again, it's not extremely common to see here, but it's also, you know, not completely ruled out in our area. But I do see them more often farther to the north. There are, okay, so those are the main fronts that we talked about. We've talked about cold, warm, stationary, and occluded. Now we're going to talk about these three extras. Can you see that? Dry lines, squall lines, and troughs. So a dry line is the same idea as a cold front or warm front, except it's really just dividing two dry or less dry air masses, or two air masses with different moisture contents. So this would be the symbol for a dry line. It's kind of this warm front sort of looking thing, but it's brown and the half moons are open and a little closer together. So this happens especially when two different air masses, like for example a desert southwest, very dry, desert origins air mass, and the Gulf of Mexico air mass, which of course would be laden with a lot more water. When those two air masses are jutted up next to each other, sometimes you can get one of these very defined dry lines. Sometimes they can introduce chances for strong storms, so sometimes that's something, it plays a role in severe storm setups. And dry air is more dense, and it basically forces the moist, lighter air upwards. So that's why you would get a lot of lift sometimes with those lines. Here is something that we actually don't put on our weather maps too often because it's super obvious to point out. This would be the line for a squall line. So this kind of dotted, sort of dashed and dots line, that would indicate that line of showers and thunderstorms that moves in often with cold fronts. So often what we do is we track these squall lines pretty closely as they are moving in and approaching the area, and then as they move all the way through the New Orleans area. Often they'll kind of weaken a bit when they reach far enough south into our area, so that is sometimes a setup that we get in New Orleans, but sometimes they're strong. As you know, we've had these very strong lines of storms move through. Sometimes they have little bowing segments, sometimes they're very straight, sometimes they kind of bow out a bit, and we can talk about that maybe in another weather lesson, but those bowing areas would indicate very high wind gusts. So sometimes these lines can bring high wind gusts and storms. So the idea with the squall line is that they form out often ahead of a cold front, and that would happen because rain-cooled air under these thunderstorms kind of surges forward, and along that what we would call outflow, more showers and thunderstorms can form. So that is something that turns up on surface maps sometimes, but again, we often don't really mark it on our weather maps because usually it's pretty obvious to see if we're showing you, for example, a radar screen in our local weather expert weather forecast. And then here is something that you may have seen us show a time or two, and this would be just this dashed line. That would be the symbol for a trough. And a trough is just an elongated area of low pressure. So sometimes that happens, a lot of times we talk about low pressure farther up in the atmosphere, or like a low, we'll put in the big L, with the surface low pressure area showing where these are, but sometimes it's not exactly, just a point. Sometimes it's kind of spread out. And so for that, we would use the symbol with a dashed line, which would be a trough. So a trough of low pressure. And we can get into some of these details a little bit more in future weather lessons. But we were able today to talk about all of those different things. So the next time, hopefully you see one of your weather forecasts, and of course we are always updating our surface maps with all these different things to show you what's going on. Hopefully you'll be able to recognize, especially my student friends, either cold fronts showing where the cooler air is moving, warm fronts, stationary fronts showing that these air masses aren't moving much, or occluded fronts. So that would be something fun to watch for the next time you see a weathercast. If you see that purple front, you will be able to say, oh, that's an occluded front. It involves 3 air masses, and it happens when the cold air catches up to the cool air. You could kind of impress maybe some of your other weather-minded friends. And then we have dry lines, squall lines, and troughs. Dry lines, same idea as a cold front, but the main difference is the moisture in the 2 air masses. Squall lines, which would be those lines of strong thunderstorms that we track so often. And also troughs, which would be elongated areas of low pressure. So today we did cover all of that. Again, I don't know if you guys are into this, but let me just tell you about this cold front again that we're getting as we speak. It's moving in right now to South Louisiana, and I've actually been watching as I've been preparing my forecast for our new newscast. And then this afternoon, I've been watching out the windows and I'm already seeing blue sky. I'm seeing the breeze. Our rain is finished pretty much across our area. So from here on out, we're just going to be seeing really much more, well, more comfortable kind of weather. Actually, I don't know about you guys, but I have found our temperatures and humidity lately not too terrible. I mean, it was really hot last week. We were hitting those record highs, but actually in the evenings, it hasn't been too bad. I think it's been very pleasant actually. So hopefully you'd think so too. And if you do like it a little bit cooler, it will be getting cooler tomorrow. Again, 50s for morning temperatures, upper 50s on the South Shore. If you're north of the lake, it'll be more like about 50 degrees, conceivably even maybe an upper 40s temperature reading, especially farther north of the lake. And then for tomorrow afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, we're talking about temperatures only around 74. So that should be pretty pleasant. We'll have sunshine and also lower humidity too. And notice the rest of today, if you are, of course, not going out a lot of places, but if you're grabbing a little bit of exercise, or if you're just kind of out on your patio or your porch, you may notice it's pretty breezy. So that will be the cooler, drier air filtering in as we speak. So kind of fun to be able to talk about fronts on a day where we are actually getting a cold front in South Louisiana. So thank you guys for joining me. I will be back tomorrow afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, with another weather lesson. And again, especially for students who are interested in weather and want to learn a little bit of something on these afternoons after lunch, you can just turn on your WWL Facebook Live and we'll be talking about another topic tomorrow. I'm going to try to get some baking in this week. So if you're interested in that, we'll be doing that. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. You know, I'll come up with something. So we'll be doing that either tomorrow or possibly the next day. I will keep you updated. Thanks for joining me again for this weather lesson, and I will see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Take care and enjoy the cool front.